After aging out of the foster system with nothing, a young man receives a strange inheritance from the grandfather he thought had abandoned him. A single key and a deed to a forgotten piece of land, where a buried secret and a brutal winter would force him to choose who he was meant to be. If you've ever felt lost or left behind, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, because we're building a community here for people who've had to fight for their second chance. The door to the group home clicked shut behind me with a sound so final it felt like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. 18 years old. The state of California was officially done with me. $200 in a prepaid debit card, a black garbage bag holding 2 pairs of jeans, a few t-shirts, and a worn copy of a book my grandfather had given me before he disappeared from my life. That was my inheritance from a decade in the system. The social worker, a tired woman named Ms. Albright, had shaken my hand with a grip as limp as a dead fish. "Good luck, Leo," she'd said, her eyes already looking past me to the next file on her desk. Luck. It felt like a cruel joke. The sun was bright, but I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the early March air. I stood on that cracked sidewalk, the sounds of Los Angeles traffic a distant, meaningless roar. For 2 years, I'd been counting down the days to this moment, dreaming of freedom. Now that it was here, it just felt like a different kind of cage, one with no walls and no rules, which was somehow even more terrifying. I walked without any real destination, the garbage bag slung over my shoulder, a dull ache starting behind my eyes. I ended up at a small park, the kind of place people cut through but never stayed in. I sat on a bench, the wood cold and damp, and watched cars rush by on the boulevard. Each one held people going somewhere, to a job, to a family, to a home. I had none of those things. My parents were a faded photograph and a closed case file. My grandfather, the only real parent I'd ever known, had vanished when I was 8, the same year I went into the system. The official story was that he'd had a heart attack, a lonely end in a cheap motel up north. But I never believed it. Not really. It didn't feel like him. He was a man who could fix anything, who smelled of sawdust and soil, whose hands were a roadmap of calluses and scars. He wasn't the type to just end. I pulled the debit card from my pocket and stared at the generic bank logo. $200. In LA, that was maybe 3 nights in the kind of motel you'd be afraid to touch the bedspread in. After that, the street. The thought was a cold stone in my gut. I was supposed to be an adult now, but I felt like a little kid who'd gotten lost at the fair, the sounds and lights overwhelming, with no familiar hand to grab onto. My last stop before leaving the group home had been the mailroom. There was one last thing for me, a letter that had arrived a week ago, forwarded from my last 3 placements. It was a thick, legal-sized envelope, addressed to me in a familiar, spidery handwriting I hadn't seen in a decade. My grandfather's handwriting. My hands had trembled as I took it. Ms. Albright had watched me, her expression a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "Probably just some old paperwork," she'd said. "Don't get your hopes up." I hadn't opened it yet. I was too afraid. Afraid of what it would say, and even more afraid that it would say nothing at all. Just some legal notice about his official death certificate. Hope is a dangerous thing when you have nothing else. It can be the one thing that breaks you. But sitting on that bench, with the city's indifference pressing in on me, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. My future was a blank, terrifying wall, and this letter was the only door, even if it led nowhere. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of exhaust fumes and desperation, and tore the seal. Inside, there were 2 things: The first was a single, old-fashioned skeleton key, heavy and ornate, its brass finish tarnished with age. It felt cold and solid in my palm. The second was a sheaf of papers, folded neatly. On top was a handwritten letter. "Leo," it began, and the sight of my name in his script made my throat tighten. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are a man. I am sorry, boy. I am sorry for all of it. I know you must hate me. I know you think I left you. It's more complicated than that. The world isn't a kind place, and I did what I had to do to keep you safe. Not right, maybe, but it was the only way I saw. I never stopped thinking about you, not for a single day." My vision blurred. I had to stop and wipe my eyes on the sleeve of my thin jacket. I cried for the 8-year-old boy who had waited by the window for a grandfather who never came back. I cried for the teenager who had hardened his heart, telling himself he didn't need anyone. And I cried for the man I was supposed to be now, who felt just as lost as that little boy. The letter continued. "I haven't left you much, not in the way the world values things. The money is gone. I spent it all. But I've left you a place to stand, a place to be. The papers with this are a quitclaim deed. It's yours. 100 acres in northern Montana, free and clear. It's not much to look at, and the winters are hell, but it's paid for. No one can take it from you. The key is for a box you'll find there. Everything you need to know, everything I could never say, is in that box. The choice of what to do next will be yours and yours alone. Be brave, Leo. You have more of your grandmother in you than you know. She was the strong one, your Gramps." Beneath the letter was the deed, a dry legal document full of township coordinates and section numbers that meant nothing to me. And stapled to it was a one-way bus ticket from Los Angeles to a town called Kalispell, Montana, dated for the next day. A bus ticket. He'd planned this. He knew I'd be 18, knew I'd be alone, knew I'd have nothing. The thought was both a comfort and a fresh wound. He'd been watching, or at least planning, all this time. While I was bouncing from one foster home to another, feeling like the world's forgotten garbage, he was setting this up. Montana. It sounded like another planet. I looked at the key in my hand, then at the bus ticket. I had $200, a garbage bag of clothes, and a mystery waiting for me at the edge of the world. It wasn't a choice. It was the only path there was. I stood up, the bench groaning in protest. The city noise seemed to fade. For the first time all day, I knew where I was going. I was going home. Or at least, to whatever home was. The bus station was a purgatory of flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. I sat on a hard plastic chair, my garbage bag at my feet, the key a heavy weight in my pocket. For 36 hours, I watched America slide by outside the grimy window. The sprawling suburbs of California bled into the vast, empty deserts of Nevada and Utah, then gave way to the rugged, snow-dusted mountains of Idaho and finally Montana. With every mile, the world grew bigger and emptier. The cities shrank into towns, the towns into lonely clusters of houses. The sky seemed to open up, a vast pale blue canvas that made me feel impossibly small. I didn't talk to anyone. I listened to the low murmur of conversations around me, the crying of a baby, the soft snores of a man in the seat across the aisle. I was a ghost on a journey to a place I couldn't imagine. I ate vending machine crackers and drank lukewarm water from a bottle I refilled at every stop. The $200 had to last. I had no idea what I would find or what I would need. When the bus finally hissed to a stop in Kalispell, it was late afternoon. The air that hit me when the doors opened was so cold and clean, it was like a physical blow. It scoured my lungs, a stark contrast to the thick, hazy air of L.A. The town was nestled in a valley, surrounded by jagged, snow-covered peaks that clawed at the sky. It was beautiful and terrifying. I stood outside the small depot, feeling like I'd landed on another planet. A few people bustled past, bundled in thick coats and hats, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They looked at me, at my thin jacket and worn jeans, with a kind of mild, pitying curiosity. City kid. Lost. I didn't have a phone, so I found a payphone, a relic I'd only seen in movies, and used the last of my change to call the only number I had, a taxi service listed on a peeling flyer inside the station. A battered old Subaru pulled up a few minutes later, driven by a man with a thick gray beard and a face weathered like old leather. He looked me over once. "Where to?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. I showed him the deed. He squinted at the coordinates, then nodded slowly. "That's a ways out, past Whitefish, up toward the North Fork. You sure that's where you want to go? There ain't much out there." I nodded. "I'm sure." He shrugged, a gesture that said it was my money and my funeral. "All right, hop in. It'll be about $60. $60. Nearly a third of what I had left. The stone in my gut was back. I got in, the car smelling of pine needles and wet dog. We drove out of town, the neat houses and storefronts quickly giving way to wide open fields and dense forests of pine and fir. The road narrowed, turning from pavement to gravel. Snow was piled high on the shoulders, dirty and hard-packed. We passed isolated ranches with smoke curling from their chimneys. But soon, even those disappeared. There was just the road, the trees, and the mountains looming over us. "So," the driver said, his eyes on the rearview mirror, "visiting family?" The question was casual, but it felt loaded. "Something like that," I said, my voice tight. He seemed to get the message and didn't press. We drove in silence for another 20 minutes. The sun was beginning to dip below the mountain peaks, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. The temperature was dropping fast. Finally, he slowed the Subaru and pulled over. "This is it," he said, pointing. "Township 32 North, Range 21 West. Your parcel starts about 100 yards up that track." He was pointing at a barely there path, little more than 2 ruts in the snow, leading off the main gravel road into a thick stand of lodgepole pines. A rusty, dilapidated gate hung crookedly on one hinge, a faded "No Trespassing" sign nailed to it. "You want me to wait?" he asked, a hint of concern in his voice now. "Make sure you find who you're looking for?" I shook my head, forcing a confidence I didn't feel. "No, I'll be fine." He looked at me, then at the darkening woods, and sighed. "All right, kid, your call." I paid him, the cash feeling like a lifeline slipping through my fingers. I got out, my garbage bag in hand. He hesitated for a moment, then leaned over. "Listen, the forecast is calling for a big one. A real monster of a blizzard, supposed to hit tomorrow night. If you're planning on staying out here, you better be prepared. This ain't L.A. He didn't wait for a reply. He put the car in gear, made a careful 3-point turn, and drove away, his taillights shrinking into red dots before disappearing completely. And then I was alone. The silence was absolute, not the muffled silence of a city at night, but a deep, profound quiet that pressed in on my ears. The only sound was the faint whisper of the wind through the pines and the thumping of my own heart. It was getting dark fast. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, washed over me. What was I doing here? This was insane. I was going to freeze to death before I even found whatever it was I was supposed to find. I took a few deep breaths, the icy air burning my throat. "Be brave, Leo," my grandfather's words. I gripped the key in my pocket. It was the only thing that felt real. I pushed the groaning gate open and started up the track, my worn sneakers sinking into the snow with every step. The path was barely visible, but I followed it deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around me like a dark cathedral. After about 10 minutes of walking, the trees opened up into a large clearing. And there it was. It wasn't a cabin or a house. It was a Quonset hut. A long, semicircular structure of corrugated metal, like a giant, half-buried tin can. It was rusted in places, with snow drifted high against its sides. A single, rickety-looking stovepipe jutted from the roof. It looked abandoned, desolate, and utterly pathetic. This was it? This was the legacy? A bitter laugh escaped my lips, turning into a cloud of vapor in the cold air. I trudged through the deep snow to the front of the hut. There was a single door, made of heavy wood, with a small, grimy window set into it. Next to the door was a large, heavy-duty metal lockbox, the kind used for construction sites, bolted to the metal wall. It was painted a dull gray, with flecks of rust blooming at the seams. I looked at the key in my hand. It didn't fit the lock on the door, which was a standard, modern deadbolt. It had to be for the lockbox. I walked over, my heart hammering against my ribs. The lock on the box was as old and ornate as the key. I slid the key in. It turned with a satisfying, heavy clunk. I lifted the heavy lid of the box. Inside, protected from the elements, was another key, a simple, modern one, and a small, leather-bound journal. I used the new key on the door to the hut. The lock turned, and with a shove, the door swung inward with a long, low groan, opening into darkness. I stood at the threshold, the last of the daylight fading behind me. I didn't know what I was walking into. I didn't know if this was a shelter or a tomb, but it was the only thing I had. Taking one last look at the vast, indifferent wilderness, I stepped inside and pulled the heavy door shut behind me, plunging myself into the cold, musty dark. The air inside the Quonset was frigid and still, thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and something else. Something faintly metallic and oily, like a long, dormant workshop. My eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, aided by the faint light filtering through the single, dirty window. The space was cavernous, much larger than it had appeared from the outside. The curved metal walls soared up to a high arch, creating a space that felt like the belly of a whale. It was mostly empty. A long workbench ran along one wall, cluttered with old tools, jars of screws and nails, and spider webs as thick as cotton. In the center of the room stood a pot-bellied wood stove, its black iron surface covered in a layer of rust. A pile of split firewood was stacked neatly beside it, along with a box of kindling. My grandfather had left it ready. The thought sent a strange shiver through me. On the far side of the hut, A section had been partitioned off with rough-hewn planks of wood, creating a small, room-like area. I could see the edge of a simple cot and a small table inside. My first priority was light and heat. I was starting to shiver uncontrollably, the cold seeping deep into my bones. I found a book of matches on the workbench, thankfully still dry. My hands were clumsy with cold, but after a few fumbled attempts, I managed to get a small fire going in the stove. I crumpled pages from the journal I'd found. It seemed to be an old ledger filled with numbers, and added kindling, gently blowing on the fledgling embers until they caught. The fire took hold with a satisfying whoosh, and soon a small circle of warmth began to push back against the oppressive cold. The stovepipe began to tick and groan as it heated up. It was a sound of life in the crushing silence. With the fire going, I turned my attention back to the lockbox. I brought the leather journal over to the stove, huddling close to its growing warmth, and opened it. The first page was another note from my grandfather, written in the same spidery hand. "Leo, if you've made it this far, you're stronger than I thought. Or maybe just more desperate. Doesn't matter. You're here. This place isn't much, I know. I bought it cheap from the government after the war. It was part of an old radar station. But it's solid. The wind can howl and the snow can pile up to the roof, but it will hold. Your first lesson: things don't have to be pretty to be strong. There are supplies, canned goods under the cot, more firewood in the lean-to out back, water from the well, but you'll need to boil it. The hand pump is old, but it works. This journal has instructions for everything: how to run the stove, how to work the pump, how to survive a Montana winter. Read it, learn it. Your life might depend on it. But that's not why I brought you here. The real reason is in the floor." The floor? I looked down. The floor of the hut was poured concrete, cracked and uneven in places. The letter continued. "Go to the workshop. In the third drawer from the top, you'll find a hammer and a chisel. In the back corner of the sleeping area, there's a section of the floor that sounds different when you tap it. It's a hollow space. Your grandmother called it the storm cellar. We never used it for storms. Break it open. The key from the first letter is for what you find inside. I'm sorry to make you work for it, boy, but nothing worth having comes easy. And some things need to be protected, not just from others, but from time itself. Be careful. The truth is heavier than any stone." My heart was pounding. A secret in the floor. This was feeling less like an inheritance and more like a treasure hunt designed by a madman. I went to the workbench and found the drawer. The hammer and chisel were there, right where he said they'd be, their metal cool to the touch. I carried them over to the partitioned-off sleeping area. It was small and sparse. A metal cot with a thin mattress and a pile of wool blankets. A small wooden table and a single chair. Under the cot, I found several large crates, and prying one open revealed rows and rows of canned food. Beans, soup, vegetables, stew. Enough to last for months. My grandfather hadn't been kidding. He had prepared this place for a siege. I pushed the cot aside and knelt on the cold concrete. I started tapping with the back of the hammer, moving methodically from the wall outwards. Tap, tap, tap. A series of dull, solid thuds. Then, about 3 feet from the corner, the sound changed. Thunk. It was a deeper, hollower sound. I'd found it. My hands were shaking, a mixture of cold, excitement, and a deep, gnawing fear of the unknown. What could be so important that he'd hide it under concrete? I positioned the chisel on a crack near the edge of the hollow section and brought the hammer down. The crack widened. I struck it again and again, the sharp clang of metal on metal echoing in the cavernous space. It was hard work. The concrete was thick, and my arms, weak from poor nutrition and inactivity, quickly began to burn. Sweat beaded on my forehead, even in the cold. But I kept going, fueled by a desperate need to know. After what felt like an hour, I had managed to break away a large enough piece to get my fingers underneath. I heaved, and a square section of concrete, about 3 feet by 3 feet, lifted up with a grating sound, revealing a dark, square hole beneath. A wooden ladder led down into the blackness. The air that rose from the opening was stale and cold, like a tomb. I grabbed a flashlight from the workbench. It, too, was right where you'd expect it to be, and shined its beam into the hole. It was a small, stone-lined cellar, about 10 feet deep, and sitting in the middle of the floor was a single, large, metal footlocker. Getting the footlocker out was another ordeal. It was incredibly heavy. I had to attach a rope to its handles and use a pulley system that was conveniently, and almost spookily, coiled on a hook right next to the opening. My grandfather had thought of everything. He had orchestrated this entire discovery, step by painstaking step. Finally, I managed to haul the footlocker up onto the main floor. It was old, army green, with the words U.S. Army stenciled faintly on the side. And on the front, it had a heavy-duty lock, the same antique, ornate style as the one on the outside box. I took out the skeleton key, the key he had sent me in the mail, the key that had started this whole journey. With a trembling hand, I inserted it into the lock. It slid in perfectly. I turned it. There was a loud, satisfying series of clicks as the internal mechanism disengaged. I took a deep breath, my breath pluming in the cold air, and I lifted the lid. The contents were not what I expected. There was no gold, no jewels, no pile of cash. Instead, it was filled to the brim with stacks of paper, bundled and tied with string. And on top of the papers sat a small, shoebox-sized wooden box, and a small, old-fashioned cassette tape player with a single tape already loaded inside. A note was taped to the player. It read, "Play me first, then you'll understand the rest." I pressed the play button. After a moment of hiss, a familiar voice filled the silent hut. It was my grandfather's voice, but it sounded older, more tired than I remembered, and it was filled with a sadness that broke my heart. "Leo," his recorded voice began, a little shaky, full of static and the weight of years. "If you're listening to this, it means you made it. It means you followed the breadcrumbs. I'm proud of you, boy. I really am." The sound of his voice, so real and yet so distant, was a physical shock. I sank down onto the cold concrete floor, my back against the footlocker, and just listened. There's no easy way to say any of this. I've run these words through my head 1,000 times, and they never get any easier. The story you were told about me, about my death, it was a lie, a necessary one. The story about your parents, that was a lie too. I tensed up, my whole body going rigid. Your father, my son, was a good man. He was a journalist, an investigative reporter. He was stubborn, like me. He believed in the truth. He believed that if people knew the truth, they would do the right thing. He was wrong. There was a long pause on the tape, filled only with the faint hiss. I could almost picture him, sitting in a lonely room somewhere, speaking into a cheap microphone, trying to find the right words. He was working on a story, a big one, about a land development company back in California, a company called Westward Horizons. They were buying up huge tracts of land in rural counties, promising jobs and prosperity. But it was a scam. They were using shell corporations, bribing local officials, forcing people out of their homes with legal threats and intimidation. They were poisoning wells to devalue property. They were ruthless. Your dad found the proof. He had documents, sworn affidavits, bank records. He had the whole thing, ready to go to print. Another pause. This time I heard him take a shaky breath. They found out. I don't know how. They came to the house. It wasn't a warning. They weren't there to talk. My blood ran cold. I remembered that night, but only in flashes, like a nightmare. Shouting, the sound of breaking glass, my grandfather grabbing me, hiding me in a closet. They killed them, Leo. They killed your father and your mother. They made it look like a home invasion gone wrong, a robbery. The police report said it was random. It wasn't random. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot against my cold skin. I didn't try to stop them. The fragmented memories were starting to slot into place, the fuzzy edges sharpening into horrifying clarity. The smell of smoke, my grandfather's panicked face in the closet door, his finger to his lips. I was there. I was in the workshop out back. I heard the commotion. By the time I got there, it was too late. I saw them leaving. 2 men. I saw their faces. I found you in the closet, safe. But I knew they would be back. They hadn't found what they were looking for. Your dad was smart. He had a safe deposit box, a dead man's switch. If anything happened to him, all the evidence was set to be released. But they didn't know that. They thought the evidence was in the house. And they would keep looking until they found it, or until they silenced anyone who might know where it was. That meant me, and it meant you. The story poured out of the little speaker, a torrent of secrets that rewrote my entire life. He explained how he faked his own death, using an old friend and a lot of cash to create a paper trail that led to a John Doe in a morgue hundreds of miles away. He had to disappear, to become a ghost, so they would stop looking for him. But he couldn't take me with him. A man on the run with a traumatized 8-year-old grandson? We wouldn't have lasted a week. They would have found us. Putting you in the system was the hardest thing I've ever done. His voice cracked, thick with an ancient grief. It felt like cutting off my own arm. I had to walk away from you, knowing you'd think I'd abandoned you, knowing you'd be alone. I chose to let you hate me so that you could live. It was a terrible choice, Leo, maybe the wrong one. I've lived with it every single day for 10 years. He had spent those 10 years on the run, living under assumed names, working cash jobs, always looking over his shoulder. The men who killed my parents were part of something bigger than just a crooked company. Westward Horizons was a front for a powerful criminal syndicate. They had deep pockets and long arms, with connections in law enforcement and politics. I couldn't fight them, he said, his voice flat with defeat. Not head on. They were too big. So I ran. And I planned. I saved every penny I could. I bought this land under a false name, paid in cash. I built this place with my own hands. A bolt hole. A place off the grid where a man could disappear. I thought maybe one day I could come back for you. But the years went by. They never stopped looking for the evidence. Your dad's dead man's switch never went off. The lawyer he trusted must have been bought or scared off. So the files stayed locked away, and the syndicate kept growing stronger. I realized I could never come back for you. But I could leave you a way out. A place to start over, far away from all of it. The tape clicked off. Silence rushed back into the hut, heavier than before. I sat there for a long time, the cold floor seeping into me, my mind reeling. My entire past was a lie. My grandfather hadn't abandoned me. He had saved me. My parents weren't victims of random violence. They were murdered for telling the truth. The grief was immense, a physical weight that pressed down on my chest. But underneath it, something else was stirring. A slow, burning anger and a profound, aching love for the old man who had sacrificed everything. I looked at the footlocker. It was full of papers. I reached in and pulled out one of the bundles. It was a stack of files held together with a rubber band. The top page was a copy of a deed. I recognized the name of the company instantly. Westward Horizons. I started to understand. This wasn't just old paperwork. This was it. This was my father's work. This was the evidence. My grandfather hadn't just run. He had retrieved the files from the safe deposit box. He had been protecting them all these years, and now he had left them to me. The wooden box was still sitting on top. My hands were shaking as I opened it. It wasn't full of papers. It was full of cash. Stacks and stacks of worn $100 bills. A quick count of the top bundles told me there had to be at least $200,000. A note was tucked inside. "This is what's left, Leo. It's not a fortune, but it's enough. Enough to disappear. Take this money. Go anywhere in the world. Change your name. Start a new life. Forget this place. Forget the files. Forget all of it. Live. That's all I ever wanted for you. The other option is to stay, to use the evidence, to finish what your father started. But I have to warn you, boy. If you do that, they will come for you, just like they came for him. The choice is yours. Burn it all and live a quiet life, or fight and maybe die for something that matters. I'm sorry to put this burden on you. I truly am." I sat there, in the cold, dusty light of the Quonset hut, with a fortune in dirty money in my lap, and a legacy of truth heavy enough to crush a man. The wind had started to pick up outside, a low moan that was slowly rising to a shriek. The blizzard the taxi driver had warned me about was coming. I was trapped, in more ways than one. The weight of the choice pressed down on me, heavier than the roof of the hut. Burn the files and run. Take the money and vanish. Become someone else, somewhere else. A life of quiet anonymity, free from the ghosts of the past. It was a seductive thought. I could go to college, travel, build a life that was mine, unburdened by my father's crusade or my grandfather's fear. I had spent a decade feeling powerless, a piece of paper in a file cabinet, a number in the system. The money offered a different kind of power, the power to escape, or stay. Stay here, in this frozen wasteland, with a box of dynamite that could either blow up a criminal empire or blow up in my face. Finish what my father started. Give meaning to his death, to my mother's death, to my grandfather's years of lonely exile. It was a choice between a life of safety and a life of significance. And I was just a kid, an 18-year-old kid who had, until yesterday, thought his biggest problem was where he was going to sleep next week. I felt a surge of anger. Anger at my grandfather for putting this on me. Anger at my father for being so reckless, so idealistic. Anger at the faceless men who had shattered my world and then forgotten I even existed. The anger was a hot, clean fire in my chest. But underneath it, the grief was a vast, cold ocean. I spread the contents of the footlocker out on the concrete floor. The files were meticulously organized. Financial records, internal memos on Westward Horizons letterhead, sworn witness statements with names and dates, maps of contaminated water tables. It was all there. A decade-old story of corporate greed and murder, perfectly preserved. My father's ghost was in those pages. I could almost feel his presence in the room, a quiet, determined man I barely remembered, who believed the truth was worth dying for. And my grandfather, who believed his grandson's life was worth more than the truth. I sat there for hours, the wood stove crackling, the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf. The storm had arrived. Snow began to pelt against the metal walls, a frantic, insistent tapping that grew into a steady roar. The world outside was disappearing into a swirling vortex of white. I was completely and utterly cut off. The decision felt impossibly large. I was paralyzed by it. I thought about the foster homes, the endless succession of strange houses, strange rules, strange families who looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. The constant feeling of being temporary, of not belonging anywhere. I had learned to make myself small, to be quiet, to not cause trouble, to survive. Running was what I knew. Fighting was a foreign concept. I picked up the wooden box full of cash. I could feel the weight of it, the promise of it. I could walk away. I could survive. But as I held it, I thought of my grandfather's words on the tape. I chose to let you hate me so that you could live. He had made a terrible choice, and it had cost him everything. Now he had given me a choice. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I couldn't make the same one. I couldn't choose my own safety over the memory of my parents. I couldn't let their deaths be meaningless. To run would be to spit on their graves, to invalidate my grandfather's sacrifice. It would be the ultimate act of cowardice. And I was tired of being a coward. I was tired of being a victim. The decision settled not with a bang, but with a quiet, grim resolve. I would stay. I would fight. I didn't know how. I didn't know what the first step was, but I knew I couldn't run. Not anymore. This place, this rusty tin can in the middle of nowhere, was no longer just a shelter. It was a command post. It was my inheritance. It was my home. I carefully packed the files back into the footlocker. I put the box of money in there as well. Not as an escape fund, but as a war chest. I locked it with the skeleton key and slid it under the cot, out of sight. The blizzard raged outside, a full-throated symphony of fury. The wind shrieked, and I could feel the whole structure of the Quonset vibrating slightly against the onslaught. But inside, with the fire roaring in the stove, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had a purpose. For the first time in my life, I knew what I was supposed to do. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer in charge. Determination was. I spent the rest of the night reading the journal my grandfather had left me, the one with instructions for survival. I learned about banking the fire to last through the night, about how to check the flue for snow blockages, about the signs of a roof getting overloaded. I was a student, and the wilderness was my teacher. That night, as the world was being buried in snow, Leo the foster kid died, and someone new began to take his place. The blizzard was relentless. For 3 days, the world was nothing but a roaring, blinding whiteness. The wind was a physical force, a constant, malevolent pressure against the walls of the hut. Snow piled up in enormous drifts, burying the windows, plunging the interior into a perpetual twilight, lit only by the flickering glow of the wood stove. The sound was immense, a deafening combination of a high-pitched shriek and a low, guttural roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. The Quonset groaned and shuddered under the assault, and tiny jets of fine, powdery snow would occasionally puff in through invisible seams in the metal. It was like being in the belly of a beast. I lost all track of time. Day and night blurred into a single, long twilight. My life shrank to the simple, brutal necessities of survival. Keeping the fire fed, melting snow for water, rationing the canned food. My grandfather's journal was my Bible. I followed its instructions to the letter. Every few hours, I would bundle up in the layers of old wool clothes I found in a trunk and fight my way out the door, a shovel in hand. The snow was so deep, it was like swimming through sugar. I had to clear the area around the door, and most importantly, the stovepipe, to prevent carbon monoxide from building up inside. The work was exhausting. The wind would tear the breath from my lungs and drive ice crystals into my face like tiny needles. Every trip outside was a battle that left me gasping and trembling, my muscles screaming in protest. But every time I came back inside, to the relative warmth and safety of the hut, a grim sense of satisfaction would wash over me. I was surviving. I was doing it. I spent the long hours in between chores, reading my father's files. I absorbed the details of the Westward Horizons conspiracy, memorizing names, dates, and account numbers. I traced the intricate web of shell companies and offshore accounts. It was a story of breathtaking corruption, and as I read, my resolve hardened into something unbreakable. This was not an abstract fight. These were the people who had stolen my family, my childhood, my life. I felt a cold, clear-headed anger that was far more potent than the hot rage I'd felt before. This was my war now. On the fourth day, something changed. The roaring of the wind lessened slightly, and the frantic pelting of snow against the walls subsided. But the silence that followed was, in its own way, more unnerving. It was a dead, heavy silence. And then I noticed something else. The constant, low hum that had been in the background since I'd arrived, a sound I hadn't even consciously registered, was gone. I flicked a light switch on the wall near the workbench. Nothing. I tried again. Nothing. The power was out. The realization hit me with a jolt of pure fear. The hut had electricity, run from a line off the main road. The well pump was electric. The few lights, the outlets, all dead. The journal mentioned a hand pump attachment for the well, for emergencies. But the thought of going out into the deep snow to try and rig it up in the sub-zero temperatures was daunting. The blizzard had broken me off from the world. Now the power failure had plunged me back into the 19th century. The days that followed were the hardest. The cold was a constant creeping enemy. Without the electric baseboard heaters to supplement it, the wood stove was the only source of warmth, and it was a hungry beast. I had to venture further from the hut to find the lean-to where the main woodpile was, a terrifying journey through waist-deep snowdrifts. I fell constantly, the snow sucking me down, the cold biting at any exposed skin. I thought about the taxi driver's warning, a monster of a blizzard. He hadn't been exaggerating. The isolation was profound. With no power, there was no hum of electricity, no chance of a radio working, nothing. Just the crackle of the fire, the whisper of my own breathing, and the occasional groan of the metal hut contracting in the intense cold. I started talking to myself, just to hear a voice. I would read passages from my father's files out loud, as if I were presenting the case to a jury. It kept my mind sharp. It kept the despair at bay. One afternoon, maybe a week into the power outage, My supply of pre-split firewood ran low. I had to start splitting the larger logs myself. I found an axe in the lean-to and set to work. It was brutal, clumsy work. I was not my grandfather. My swings were awkward, and the axe would often glance off the frozen wood. On one swing, I missed entirely. The axe head buried itself in the snow, and the handle, slick with ice, flew from my grasp, my hand striking a nearby log. A sharp, searing pain shot up my arm. I pulled my glove off. My knuckles were split open and bleeding, a dark red against the stark white of the snow. It wasn't a serious injury, but in that moment, it felt catastrophic. The sight of my own blood, the throbbing pain, the sheer, grinding exhaustion of it all, it broke something in me. I stumbled back into the hut, cradling my hand, and for the first time since I arrived, I broke down. I sat on the floor and sobbed, great, heaving, gut-wrenching sobs. Sobs of pain and fear and loneliness. It was all too much. The cold, the dark, the responsibility, the ghosts of my family. I was just a kid. I was going to die here. This is the part of the story where it gets real. If you've ever hit a wall, a point where you felt like you just couldn't go on, I want you to let me know in the comments. Because you're not alone. We've all been there. That moment of breaking is not the end. It's a turning point. It's the moment you find out what you're really made of. And if you're finding value in this, if it's speaking to you, please consider subscribing to the channel. We're telling stories for the people who have been through the fire and are looking for the way out. Now let's get back to it. As I sat there on the floor, crying like a lost child, my eyes fell on the pot-bellied stove. The fire was burning low. If I let it go out, I would freeze. It was that simple. The thought cut through the fog of my self-pity like a shard of ice. Die crying on the floor, or get up and put another log on the fire. It was the most basic choice of all, life or death. Slowly, painfully, I got to my feet. I went to the first aid kit my grandfather had left. Of course he'd left one, and cleaned and bandaged my hand as best I could. The pain was still there, a dull, insistent throb. But it was just pain. It wouldn't kill me. I put on my gloves, went back outside, and split another log. And another. I worked until I had a small pile, enough to last the night. That night, huddled by the stove, nursing my injured hand, I felt a shift inside me. The despair was gone, burned away by the simple, brutal clarity of survival. I had faced the abyss, and I had chosen to step back. I had chosen to live. I didn't know if I would win my war, but I knew I wouldn't be beaten by a snowstorm and a little bit of pain. The blizzard could do its worst. I was still here. I was still fighting. The power was out for 19 days. 19 days of a silent, frozen, monochrome world. I developed a rhythm, a routine born of necessity. Wake up before dawn in the bone-chilling cold. Get the fire roaring again from the banked embers. Melt snow for water. Eat a meager breakfast of canned beans. Shovel snow. Split wood. Read the files. Eat a meager dinner of canned soup. Bank the fire. Sleep. Repeat. My body hardened. The city's softness was burned away, replaced by lean muscle. My hands, even the injured one, became calloused and capable. I learned the language of the place. The way the snow creaked when the temperature plummeted. The way the smoke from the stovepipe hung in the still, frigid air. The particular groan the hut made when the wind shifted. The fear never entirely went away, but it changed. It was no longer a panicked, overwhelming terror, but a low-level hum of awareness. a respect for the power of the wilderness and the fragility of my own life. It made me careful. It kept me alive. During those long, dark days, my father's files became my companions. I wasn't just reading them anymore. I was studying them, cross-referencing them, building a case in my head. I began to see the patterns he had seen, to understand the moves and counter-moves in the deadly game he had been playing. I felt a growing connection to the father I barely knew, a deep respect for his intellect and his courage. He wasn't just a ghost, he was my teacher, and I realized my grandfather had given me the perfect place to prepare for this fight. The isolation, the hardship, the silence, it was a crucible. It was forging me into the weapon my father had needed, the one my grandfather couldn't be. He hadn't just given me a shelter and a secret, he had given me a training ground. On the morning of the 20th day, I woke up to a strange and unfamiliar sound, a low, steady hum. I lay there in my cot, listening, trying to place it. And then, with a sudden flicker, the single bare bulb over the workbench blinked on. Power. It was back. The sudden light felt harsh and intrusive after weeks of firelight and gloom. The hum of electricity felt deafening in the silence I had grown accustomed to. I got up and walked to the window, chipping away the frost with my fingernail. The world outside was transformed. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The sun was shining, glinting off a landscape buried under a blanket of pristine white snow that was at least 6 feet deep. The storm was over. I had survived. A few days later, I heard the sound of an engine. It was a low growl at first, getting steadily louder. I looked out the window and saw a massive snowplow, a county vehicle, making its way slowly down the gravel road, pushing aside a mountain of snow. Behind it was a familiar-looking Subaru. It was the taxi driver. He pulled up as close to my gate as he could and got out. He was bundled up, his beard frosted with ice. He looked at the Quonset hut, at the smoke curling from the stovepipe, and then at me as I opened the door and stepped out into the brilliant sunlight. He just stared for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Holy hell," he finally said, his voice a low whistle. "You're alive." I just nodded. I didn't know what to say. "We all thought you were a goner, kid," he went on, shaking his head in disbelief. "Nobody could have survived that out here. That was the worst storm this valley's seen in 50 years. Power was out for almost 3 weeks. We've been finding people. Well, you're lucky." Lucky. I thought about my grandfather's note. Luck had nothing to do with it. I had been prepared. "I need a ride into town," I said, my voice hoarse from disuse. "And I need to find a lawyer." The lawyer's name was Ben Carter. He was a small-town attorney with a messy office above a hardware store in Kalispell. He was semi-retired, with kind eyes and a handshake as firm as oak. I'd picked his name out of a phone book, mostly because his office was the closest one to the diner where the taxi driver had dropped me off. I walked in, looking like a wild man, thin and gaunt, with a scraggly beard and clothes that smelled of wood smoke, and I put the footlocker on his desk. "My grandfather told me to find a lawyer I could trust," I said. "I don't know if that's you, but I'm starting here." For the next 2 hours, I told him everything, the whole story. I showed him the files. I played in the tape. He listened patiently, without interruption, his expression growing more and more serious. When I was finished, he sat back in his chair and was silent for a long time, looking at the stacks of evidence on his desk. "Your father was a brave man," he said finally, his voice quiet. "And your grandfather, what he did for you was an act of profound love." He looked me straight in the eye. "You know what will happen if you release this, don't you?" Westward Horizons is now a multi-billion-dollar global corporation. The men who did this are older now, but they're more powerful than ever. They will not hesitate to silence you, permanently. I nodded. I know. And you have a box full of cash that could let you walk away from all of this, live a long, happy life, and no one would ever blame you. I know that too, I said. He studied my face, searching for something. Why? He asked. Why choose this path? For revenge? I thought for a moment. No, I said slowly. It's not about revenge. It's about justice. But more than that, it's about earning the life they gave me. My parents died for this. My grandfather lived a half-life for it. If I walk away, it all meant nothing. My life has to mean something. Ben Carter smiled, a slow, sad smile. You're your father's son, all right, he said. Okay, Leo, I'm in. We'll do this. But we'll do it smart. We won't go to the press. We won't go to the local authorities. These people have eyes and ears everywhere. We'll go federal. We'll find a prosecutor in the Justice Department, someone with a reputation for being untouchable, and we'll deliver this to them directly. The months that followed were a blur of quiet, intense work. Ben made some discreet calls, pulling on old favors from his days as a prosecutor in Seattle. He found our man, an assistant U.S. attorney in the public integrity section, known for being a bulldog. We spent weeks creating digital copies of every single document, every piece of evidence. I wrote a detailed, chronological narrative of the entire conspiracy, drawing on my father's notes and my own intensive study of the files. I was no longer just a survivor. I was a witness. I was the living link in a chain of evidence that stretched back a decade. During this time, I lived at the Quonset hut. I used some of the money from the box to buy a used truck, a generator, and some proper tools. I started fixing the place up. I patched the roof. I installed a better wood stove. I ran new wiring. I built shelves. With every nail I hammered and every board I cut, I felt like I was putting down roots. The hut was no longer a temporary shelter. It was becoming my home. I worked with my hands, just like my grandfather. And in the quiet evenings, I worked with my mind, just like my father. I was becoming a synthesis of the two men who had shaped my life. Finally, the day came. Ben and I flew to Washington, D.C. We walked into the Department of Justice building, two nobodies from Montana, with a hard drive that held the key to dismantling a criminal empire. We spent 8 hours in a windowless room with the prosecutor and a team of FBI agents, walking them through the evidence. They were skeptical at first, but as the hours went by and the sheer weight and detail of the evidence became clear, their skepticism turned to grim focus. When we were done, the prosecutor looked at me. "You've been living alone on a remote property for months, Mr. Hale," he said. "You are the only living witness to your parents' murders. You are in incredible danger." He offered me witness protection, a new name, a new life, courtesy of the U.S. Marshals. It was the same choice my grandfather had given me, wrapped in a different package. Safety, anonymity. I looked at Ben, who gave me a small, supportive nod. "No, thank you," I said. "I'm not running anymore. My name is Leo Hale. My home is in Montana. That's where they'll find me if they want to." The fallout was like a silent earthquake. There were no splashy headlines at first, just a series of quiet, high-level arrests. The CEO of Westward Horizons was taken into custody on his yacht in the Caribbean. 2 of his senior vice presidents were arrested on a golf course in Scottsdale. The 2 men who had killed my parents, now in their late 50s, were picked up in coordinated raids. One was living in a quiet suburb, a pillar of his community. The other was a low-level enforcer, still on the syndicate's payroll. The case blew open, a massive RICO investigation that exposed decades of corruption, bribery, and violence. It turned out my father's files were the missing piece of a puzzle the FBI had been trying to solve for years. The story was finally told, not just in a newspaper, but in federal court. Justice, slow and grinding, had finally arrived. I went back to the Quonset hut. I went back to my home. The world knew my name now. The story had been in the national news, a 9-day wonder about the foster kid who brought down a corporate giant. I got some strange looks in town for a while. People would point or whisper. But in a place like Montana, novelty wears off fast, and respect is earned through hard work and quiet endurance. I kept to myself. I kept working on the hut. I built a small greenhouse on the south side. I cleared a field for a garden. I learned how to hunt and fish. I became a part of the landscape. One day, the old taxi driver, whose name I learned was Hank, pulled up my track. He didn't have a fare. He just had 2 cups of coffee from the diner. He got out and handed one to me. We stood there for a while, looking out at the mountains. "Heard what you did," he said, not looking at me. "Your old man would be proud." It was the highest compliment he could give. It was the beginning of my acceptance into the community. It's been 5 years since that winter. The Quonset hut is a home now. It's warm and solid, filled with books and tools and the smell of baking bread. I have a dog, a goofy mutt I adopted from the local shelter. I have neighbors who wave when I drive by, who'll help me pull my truck out of a ditch in the winter, and expect the same in return. I never touched the rest of the money in the box. It's in a trust, funding a legal aid foundation for people fighting corrupt corporations and environmental crimes. It's my father's legacy, doing the work he can no longer do. My inheritance wasn't the land, or the money, or the files. It was the choice. The choice to stop being a victim and start being the author of my own life. It was the choice to build a home, not just with wood and nails, but with purpose and integrity. The scars of my past are still there. They always will be. But they are a part of me, a reminder of where I came from and the sacrifices that were made for me. They are not the whole of me. Home is a powerful word. For a long time, it was a word that meant nothing to me. It was a hole in my life, a space where something was supposed to be. But I learned that home isn't something you're given. It's something you build. It's the place where you decide to make your stand. It might be a rusty Quonset hut on 100 acres of frozen ground. It might be a tiny apartment in a crowded city. It doesn't matter. What matters is the choice to belong to it, to care for it, to defend it. What matters is the love you pour into it. That's what makes it sacred. That's what makes it yours. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight to find your place in the world, I hope you'll subscribe and become part of this community. Share your own story in the comments below. Tell me about the place you decided to make your stand, because every one of those stories matters. Every one of those stories is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and we need to hear them. We need to know we're not alone.